Imagine losing everything because you showed kindness to someone who couldn't speak. That's exactly what happened to Jessica Parker, a struggling nurse who was about to discover that some silences hide the most dangerous secrets. Bill Thompson sat in room 314, written off by everyone as just another stroke victim who had lost his ability to communicate. But when Jess noticed him frantically scribbling on napkins in the middle of the night, she realized something everyone else had missed. This wasn't a man who had lost his mind. This was a man trapped inside his own body, desperately trying to warn her about something. What Jess didn't know was that her simple act of compassion would make her the target of someone who had been watching from the shadows. Someone with a dark secret worth killing for. Someone who had already destroyed lives to keep that secret buried. Victoria Sterling wasn't just a hospital administrator. She was a predator in designer suits, systematically eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth. And now she had Jess in her crosshairs. As Jess worked triple shifts just to survive, sleeping in her car and stealing hospital food to eat, she had no idea she was walking into a trap 20 years in the making. A trap set by a woman who had built her entire career on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and death. Bill's shaky handwriting spelled out two words that would change everything. She's dangerous. But who was she? And what was the shocking truth that Bill was desperately trying to communicate before it was too late? The answer would reveal a conspiracy of silence, a quest for justice that had consumed decades, and a confrontation that would expose the most twisted form of karma imaginable. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Jessica Parker pushed her cart down the sterile hospital corridor. Her scrubs hung loose on her shrinking frame, and the dark circles under her eyes told a story she wished nobody could read. 3 consecutive shifts. 72 hours of keeping people alive while barely surviving herself. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something was about to change everything. Room 314 sat at the end of the hall, overlooked by most of the staff. The patient inside had been written off as just another stroke victim who had lost his ability to speak. Bill Thompson, 67 years old, admitted 3 weeks ago after collapsing in the hospital parking lot of all places. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Jess paused outside his door, checking her watch. 2:30 in the morning. The graveyard shift stretched ahead like an endless tunnel, but she had learned to find small moments of purpose in the darkness. She knocked gently and stepped inside. Bill sat upright in his bed, staring out the window at the city lights below. His silver hair caught the dim light from the hallway, and his weathered hands gripped a napkin so tightly his knuckles had turned white. When he saw Jess, his eyes widened with something that looked almost like relief. Most nurses would have checked his vitals and moved on. Most nurses didn't have time for patients who couldn't talk back. But Jess wasn't most nurses, and maybe that's why she noticed what everyone else had missed. Bill was writing, not random scribbles like the other staff assumed. His hand moved with deliberate purpose across the napkin, forming letters that trembled but held meaning. Jess moved closer, her curiosity overriding the exhaustion that had settled into her bones like concrete. The letters were shaky, barely legible, but they spelled out 2 words that made her heart skip: "Help me." She looked up at Bill's face and saw tears streaming down his cheeks. This wasn't a man who had lost his mind to a stroke. This was a man who was trapped inside his own body, screaming silently while the world moved on without him. "You can understand me, can't you?" Jess whispered, glancing toward the door to make sure they were alone. Bill nodded frantically, his eyes lighting up like someone had just thrown him a lifeline in a raging ocean. He grabbed another napkin and began writing again, his hand shaking with urgency. This time the message was longer, more desperate. "They don't listen. You're different." Jess felt something shift inside her chest. In a hospital where patients were often reduced to room numbers and insurance policies, where overworked staff barely had time to see people as human beings, she had found someone who needed exactly what she had always given freely: genuine care. But caring was expensive, and Jess was already drowning. Her car sat in the parking garage below, packed with the few belongings she had managed to salvage before losing her apartment last month. Student loan payments that consumed half her salary, credit cards maxed out from previous medical emergencies in her own family, and now sleeping in her Honda Civic between shifts because she couldn't afford first month's rent anywhere decent. She had been surviving on vending machine crackers and the occasional apple she slipped from patient meal trays that went untouched. The guilt ate at her, but hunger was a powerful motivator. Hospital cafeteria food cost more than she could spare, and her pride prevented her from asking colleagues for help. Yet here was Bill, looking at her with such desperate hope that she couldn't walk away. "What do you need?" she asked, pulling up the bedside chair that probably hadn't been used by another staff member in weeks. Bill's writing became more frantic. He filled napkin after napkin with shaky letters, pausing only to grab her hand when frustration overwhelmed him. Through patient decoding, Jess began to piece together fragments of his story. He had been a successful businessman. He had money, property, investments. But something had gone wrong. Something that had led him to collapse in this very hospital's parking lot. The most disturbing part was what he wrote about the other staff. Not the nurses, who were simply too busy to notice, but the administrators. Specifically, one administrator who visited him regularly despite having no medical reason to be there. Victoria Sterling. Jess knew the name well. Every nurse in the hospital knew Victoria Sterling. She was the woman in expensive suits who appeared whenever budgets were being cut or staff was being disciplined. She had a reputation for efficiency that often came at the expense of compassion. Patients complained about her cold demeanor, but complaints about administrators rarely led to changes. According to Bill's shaky handwriting, Victoria visited him almost daily. She would ask questions about his condition, his family, his finances. Questions that seemed inappropriate for a hospital administrator to be asking a patient who supposedly couldn't respond. But Bill could respond. He just couldn't speak. The pieces of a larger puzzle began forming in Jess's mind, but she pushed the thoughts aside. Her immediate concern was the man in front of her, isolated and afraid, treated like a piece of furniture by everyone except her. "I'm going to help you," she promised, though she had no idea how. Her own life was barely held together with prayer and determination. But something about Bill's situation called to the part of her that had chosen nursing in the first place. The belief that everyone deserved dignity, especially in their most vulnerable moments. Bill grabbed her hand again and wrote one more message that sent chills down her spine. "She's dangerous." Before Jess could ask what he meant, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Sharp, purposeful footsteps that belonged to someone who owned every space they entered. Bill's eyes went wide with terror, and he quickly crumpled up all the napkins, shoving them under his pillow. The footsteps stopped outside room 314. Victoria Sterling appeared in the doorway, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the hallway light. Even at nearly 3 in the morning, she looked like she had stepped out of a boardroom meeting. Her cold blue eyes swept the room, taking in every detail with the precision of a security camera. "Miss Parker." Victoria's voice was smooth as silk and twice as deadly. "Working late again, I see." "Just finishing my rounds," Jess replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She had never been afraid of Victoria before, but Bill's warning had planted seeds of unease that were rapidly growing into full-blown anxiety. Victoria stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor like a countdown timer. She approached Bill's bed with the practiced smile of someone who had learned to mimic human warmth without actually feeling it. "And how is our Mr. Thompson tonight?" she asked, though she was looking at Jess instead of Bill. "Still not responding to treatment, I assume?" Bill had gone completely still, his earlier desperation replaced by what looked like controlled terror. He stared straight ahead, giving no indication that he understood anything being said around him. The transformation was so complete that even Jess began to doubt what she had witnessed moments before. "His vitals are stable," Jess reported, falling back on medical facts because they felt safer than speculation. Victoria nodded and made a note on the tablet she carried everywhere. "Good. I trust you're not wasting too much time on unresponsive patients, Miss Parker. We have many others who require attention." The dismissal was clear, but something in Victoria's tone made it sound more like a warning than a suggestion. Jess gathered her supplies and headed toward the door, glancing back once at Bill. He hadn't moved, but she caught the slight movement of his hand beneath the pillow where he had hidden the napkins. As she walked down the hallway, Jess couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something much bigger than a lonely patient who needed extra attention. Bill's fear had been real. His desperate attempts to communicate had been real. And Victoria's interest in a supposedly unresponsive patient felt anything but routine. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of medication rounds and vital checks. But her mind kept returning to room 314. By the time dawn broke through the hospital windows, Jess had made a decision that would change everything. She was going to help Bill Thompson find his voice again, no matter what it cost her. She just had no idea that the price would be higher than she ever imagined, and the truth he was trying to tell her would shake the very foundations of everything she thought she knew about mercy, justice, and the thin line between them. The next evening, Jess arrived at work with a small bag tucked under her arm. Inside were puzzle books, communication boards, and art supplies she had bought with the last $20 in her checking account. $20 that should have gone toward gas or food, but Bill's desperate eyes had haunted her all day. She had spent her break researching stroke recovery and communication methods online at the hospital library. If the speech therapy department couldn't help Bill because of budget cuts, she would find another way. She had to. Room 314 felt different when she entered that night. Bill was awake, sitting in the same position by the window, but this time he turned toward her immediately. His eyes tracked her movement as she set down her supplies, and she caught the faintest hint of a smile. "I brought you something," she said quietly, pulling out a laminated communication board with letters, numbers, and common phrases. "This might be easier than napkins." Bill's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Tears streamed down his face as he reached for the board with shaking hands. He pointed to letters with desperate precision. "Thank you." For the next hour, they worked together in careful silence. Jess had learned to listen for footsteps in the hallway, and Bill had learned to hide their communication tools whenever someone approached. It felt like a conspiracy, but also like the most important work she had ever done. Through painstaking letter-by-letter communication, Bill began to tell his story. He had been the CEO of Thompson Industries, a construction company that had built half the commercial buildings in the city. Successful, wealthy, but haunted by a tragedy from 20 years ago that had shaped every decision since. His wife, Margaret, had died in a hospital, not from the cancer she was fighting, but from negligence. A young nurse had made a series of critical errors, then covered them up when Margaret's condition deteriorated. The nurse had falsified records, destroyed evidence, and let Margaret die rather than admit her mistakes. Bill had tried to seek justice through the courts, but the evidence had mysteriously disappeared. The nurse had vanished from the hospital, her employment records scrubbed clean. It was as if she had never existed. The case was dropped, the hospital paid a quiet settlement, and Margaret's death was officially ruled as complications from her illness. But Bill never forgot. He spent years and considerable resources tracking the nurse who had killed his wife. Private investigators, leaked personnel files, anything that might lead him to the truth. And 3 months ago, he had finally found her. Victoria Sterling, former nurse turned hospital administrator. She had changed her name, altered her credentials, and built an entire new identity around covering up her past. But Bill had found her working at City General Hospital, in a position of power over the very people she had once failed. The night Bill collapsed in the parking lot, he had been coming to confront Victoria with evidence of her past. The stress and emotion had triggered his stroke, but it hadn't dulled his memory or his determination. If anything, being trapped in silence had given him a different kind of clarity. Victoria's daily visits weren't about patient care. She was checking to see if Bill could communicate, if he remembered who she was, if he posed a threat to the new life she had built on the grave of his wife. Every conversation she had with his doctors, every question about his prognosis, was really about her own survival. "She's been watching you too," Bill spelled out on his communication board during their third night together. "Ever since you started helping me." Jess felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. She had noticed Victoria appearing more frequently on her floor, asking questions about patient care that seemed unusually detailed. Questions about which nurses spent extra time with which patients. Questions about unauthorized use of hospital resources. "What kind of watching?" Jess asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Bill's response came in careful, deliberate letters. "Building a case. She destroys people who get in her way." The pieces began falling into place with terrifying clarity. Victoria's reputation for efficiency wasn't about improving hospital operations. It was about eliminating threats. Nurses who asked too many questions found themselves written up for minor infractions. Staff members who showed too much independence faced budget cuts that eliminated their positions. Anyone who might discover her secret was systematically removed. And now Jess was in her crosshairs. She's been documenting everything, Bill continued. The food you take from patient trays, the supplies you use for me. She's building a theft case. Jess's hands trembled as she absorbed this information. Every apple she had taken from untouched meal trays, every puzzle book she had bought with her own money but used during work hours, every minute she had spent with Bill instead of other patients. All of it could be twisted into evidence of misconduct. There's more, Bill spelled out, his eyes darting toward the door. She's done this before. Other nurses. Other hospitals. I have proof. Before he could explain further, the familiar sound of sharp heels echoed in the hallway. Bill immediately went rigid, assuming his unresponsive pose while Jess quickly gathered the communication materials. But she wasn't fast enough. Victoria appeared in the doorway just as Jess was sliding the laminated board under Bill's pillow. The administrator's cold eyes missed nothing, cataloging every detail with the precision of a predator studying its prey. Miss Parker. Victoria's voice carried a new edge that hadn't been there before. You seem to spend a great deal of time in this particular room. Mr. Thompson requires frequent monitoring, Jess replied, trying to keep her voice professional despite the fear clawing at her throat. Victoria stepped into the room, her tablet ready to record whatever evidence she was about to create. And what exactly are you monitoring? He's been unresponsive for weeks. The question was a trap, and they both knew it. If Jess claimed Bill was responding, she would have to explain why she hadn't reported it. If she maintained he was unresponsive, Victoria would question why she spent so much time with an unresponsive patient. I believe in providing comfort care to all patients, Jess said carefully. Comfort care, Victoria repeated, making a note on her tablet. Is that what you call taking food from patient meal trays? Using hospital supplies for unauthorized activities? Neglecting other patients to focus on one who can't even acknowledge your presence? Each accusation landed like a physical blow. Victoria had been watching more carefully than Jess had realized, documenting every small kindness as evidence of professional misconduct. I've never neglected any patient, Jess said, finding strength in the truth of that statement. Haven't you? Victoria moved closer to Bill's bed, studying his seemingly vacant expression. Tell me, Miss Parker, what do you know about this man's background? The question caught Jess off guard. He's a stroke patient who needs care. He's a wealthy businessman with significant assets and no immediate family, Victoria corrected. The kind of patient who might be vulnerable to manipulation by staff members facing financial difficulties. The implication hit Jess like a slap. Victoria wasn't just building a case for theft. She was constructing a narrative of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and professional misconduct that would destroy Jess's career and potentially land her in prison. I would never, Jess began, but Victoria cut her off. Of course you wouldn't. Intentionally. Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. But desperation makes people do things they never thought possible. Sleeping in your car, taking food from patient trays, spending inappropriate amounts of time with wealthy patients who can't report your behavior. It paints a concerning picture. Bill remained motionless throughout the exchange, but Jess caught the slight tension in his hands. He was hearing everything, understanding the trap that was closing around both of them. I think it would be best if Mr. Thompson was assigned to a different nurse, Victoria continued. Someone with better boundaries. And I think you should expect a meeting with Human Resources tomorrow morning to discuss your recent performance issues. Victoria left without another word, her heels clicking away down the hallway like the countdown to an execution. Jess stood frozen in the middle of the room, her career and freedom crumbling around her, while the man she had tried to help watched in helpless silence. The next few days blurred together in a nightmare of documented infractions and formal warnings. Victoria had been thorough in her surveillance, producing photographs of Jess taking food, timestamps showing excessive time spent in room 314, and witness statements from other staff members who had been carefully coached to report suspicious behavior. Human Resources presented the evidence with bureaucratic efficiency. Jess was suspended pending a full investigation. Hospital security was called to escort her from the building. Her badge was deactivated, her locker searched, and her personal belongings packed into a cardboard box like the remnants of a life that no longer existed. But the worst part was leaving Bill behind. She had tried to visit him before her suspension took effect, but Victoria had already arranged for additional security. Room 314 was off-limits to all unauthorized personnel, and Jess was definitely unauthorized now. As she sat in her car in the hospital parking garage, surrounded by everything she owned in the world, Jess realized that Victoria had won. The woman who had killed Bill's wife was about to destroy another life, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. Or so she thought. Because while Victoria had been focused on building her case against Jess, she had made a critical error. She had underestimated the man in room 314, assuming that his inability to speak meant he was unable to act. Bill Thompson had spent 20 years learning patience. He had built a fortune through careful planning and strategic thinking, and he had spent the last month pretending to be helpless while documenting every word Victoria had spoken in his presence. The small device Jess had unknowingly helped him operate, thinking it was just another communication aid, had been recording everything. Every visit, every threat, every detail of Victoria's plan to destroy anyone who might expose her past. Victoria Sterling was about to learn that some secrets refused to stay buried, and some victims refused to stay silent. The war for justice was just beginning, and the woman who thought she had won was about to discover that the most dangerous enemy is the one you think you've already defeated. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, and by the time the sun set, everyone would know the truth about room 314. The Human Resources meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning that felt like Judgment Day. Jess sat in her Honda Civic in the hospital parking lot, staring up at the building where her career was about to end. The cardboard box containing her personal belongings sat in the passenger seat like a monument to failure. She had spent the past 3 days living on crackers and water, too anxious to eat and too broke to buy much food anyway. The suspension had cut off her income immediately, and with no savings to fall back on, she was facing homelessness within the week. But worse than her own situation was the thought of Bill trapped in room 314, unable to communicate his desperate warnings to anyone who would listen. Victoria had won completely, eliminating the only person who had bothered to see him as human while ensuring her own secrets remained buried. At 9:45, Jess forced herself to walk through the hospital's main entrance. The lobby buzzed with its usual morning activity, but she felt like a ghost moving through a world that no longer included her. Security guards nodded politely, unaware that she was walking toward her own professional execution. The Human Resources Department occupied the entire third floor, a maze of cubicles and conference rooms where careers were built and destroyed with equal efficiency. Victoria Sterling was already seated at the head of the conference table when Jess arrived. Her perfectly styled hair and crisp suit a stark contrast to Jess's wrinkled clothes and tired eyes. "Ms. Parker," Director Johnson nodded toward an empty chair. "Please have a seat. We have quite a bit to discuss." The evidence was laid out like pieces of a prosecutor's case. Photographs of Jess taking food from patient trays. Security footage showing her spending excessive time in room 314. Testimony from other staff members reporting suspicious behavior. And most damaging of all, Victoria's detailed reports documenting a pattern of inappropriate conduct with a vulnerable wealthy patient. "These are serious allegations," Director Johnson said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Theft of hospital property, neglect of assigned duties, and potential exploitation of a patient who cannot advocate for himself." "I never exploited anyone," Jess said, finding her voice despite the overwhelming evidence against her. "I was providing compassionate care to a patient who needed help." Victoria leaned forward with predatory interest. "Help with what exactly?" "Mr. Thompson has been completely unresponsive since his admission. He cannot speak, cannot communicate, cannot even acknowledge basic stimuli. What exactly were you helping him with?" The question was designed to trap her. If Jess claimed Bill could communicate, she would have to explain why she hadn't reported his recovery to medical staff. If she maintained he was unresponsive, her defense of providing necessary care would crumble. Before Jess could answer, the conference room door burst open with such force that everyone jumped. Bill Thompson stood in the doorway, supported by a security guard who looked confused and concerned. "I'm sorry," the guard said to Director Johnson. "He insisted on coming here. He became very agitated when we tried to keep him in his room." Bill's eyes swept the room until they found Victoria. When their gazes met, something electric passed between them. recognition, fear, and 20 years of buried rage finally breaking free. Victoria, Bill said, his voice rough from weeks of silence, but clear enough to make everyone in the room freeze. Victoria Sterling. The name hung in the air like an accusation. Victoria's face went pale, her carefully constructed composure cracking for the first time since Jess had known her. Mr. Thompson, Director Johnson stood up, clearly shaken by this unexpected development. You can speak? Why haven't you been communicating with your medical team? Bill's gaze never left Victoria's face. Because I've been waiting for the right moment. Waiting to say what I came here to say before my stroke took my voice away. He moved into the room with surprising steadiness, as if speaking had somehow restored more than just his ability to communicate. The security guard released his arm and stepped back, sensing that whatever was about to happen was bigger than hospital protocol. 20 years ago, Bill continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. My wife Margaret died in a hospital bed. Not from cancer, which she was fighting bravely. She died because a young nurse named Victoria Walsh made a series of critical errors and then covered them up to save her own career. Victoria's face had gone from pale to gray. I don't know what you're talking about, she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. You switched her medication. Gave her potassium instead of her prescribed heart medication. When she went into cardiac arrest, you panicked. Instead of calling for help immediately, you spent precious minutes trying to figure out how to cover your mistake. The room was deadly silent except for Bill's voice, which had found its full strength as he finally spoke the words he had been carrying for 2 decades. While my wife was dying, you were destroying evidence. You altered her chart, switched medication vials, and coached other staff members to lie about the timeline. By the time the code team arrived, Margaret had been without oxygen for too long. She died 3 hours later. Director Johnson looked between Bill and Victoria with growing alarm. These are very serious accusations, Mr. Thompson. Do you have any proof? Bill reached into his hospital gown and pulled out a small recording device that Jess recognized. It was the communication aid she had helped him operate, thinking she was assisting with his therapy. I've been recording every conversation Victoria has had in my presence since I regained consciousness, Bill said, including the ones where she detailed her plan to destroy Jess Parker for showing me kindness, and the one where she bragged about how easy it was to eliminate troublesome nurses by building false cases against them. Victoria shot to her feet, so quickly her chair toppled backward. That's illegal. You can't record private conversations without consent. In my own hospital room, Bill's smile was cold as winter. With the administrator who's been visiting me daily to assess whether I was a threat to her career, I think any court would find that fascinating. He pressed play on the device, and Victoria's voice filled the room with crystal clarity. The Parker woman is getting too close. She's spending too much time with him, asking too many questions. We need to eliminate her before she becomes a problem, just like I eliminated that nurse in Denver who was asking about my employment history. The recording continued for several damning minutes, revealing not just Victoria's plan to frame Jess, but her admission to similar schemes at previous hospitals, a pattern of destroying careers to protect her own secrets. Director Johnson's face had gone from confusion to horror to fury. Security, he said into his phone. I need officers in conference room B immediately. Victoria made a desperate attempt to reach for the recording device, but Bill pulled it back with surprising agility. You took everything from me 20 years ago, he said. My wife, my peace of mind, my faith in justice. But you made one critical error. What's that? Victoria snarled, her mask of professionalism finally completely stripped away. You assumed that silence meant defeat. You thought that because I couldn't speak, I couldn't fight back. But I've been fighting back every day for 20 years, and now I finally have the voice to finish what you started. Security officers arrived and moved toward Victoria, who was now backing toward the window like a cornered animal. This is a setup, she screamed. He's been planning this, manipulating everyone. That recording is doctored, fabricated. The recording is authentic, Bill said calmly. And it's not the only evidence. I've spent 20 years documenting your real identity, your falsified credentials, and your trail of destroyed careers across 3 states. Every hospital you've worked at, every nurse whose life you've ruined to cover your incompetence. He turned to Jess, who had been watching the confrontation in stunned silence. including your plan to destroy the one person in this hospital who saw me as a human being instead of a problem to be managed. The security officers reached Victoria just as she made a last desperate grab for the recording device. She fought them briefly before collapsing into sobs that sounded more like rage than remorse. "I was young," she cried. "It was a mistake. I was scared. I've spent my whole life trying to make up for it. By destroying other people's lives." Bill's voice cut through her excuses like a blade. "By ensuring that no one else would ever be held accountable for the same kind of negligence that killed my wife. You didn't make up for anything, Victoria. You made it worse." As the security officers led Victoria from the room, she turned back with pure hatred in her eyes. "You'll never prove murder," she spat. "The statute of limitations has run out. I'll be free in a few years, and I'll disappear again." Bill's smile was serene. "Who said anything about murder charges? The FBI is very interested in your pattern of healthcare fraud, identity theft, and destruction of medical records across multiple states. Federal crimes don't have the same limitations as state crimes." The door closed behind Victoria with a finality that seemed to echo through the years. 20 years of patience, planning, and pain had led to this moment, and justice had finally found its voice. Director Johnson sank into his chair, looking like a man who had just watched his entire world shift on its axis. "Mr. Thompson, I don't know what to say. The hospital had no idea about Ms. Sterling's background. We'll be conducting a full investigation immediately. Start with every nurse she's had fired or disciplined," Bill suggested. "I suspect you'll find a pattern of targeting anyone who might have discovered her incompetence." He turned to Jess, who was still processing everything that had just happened. Her suspension, her destroyed career, her life in ruins just minutes ago, and now. "Ms. Parker," Bill said, his voice gentle for the first time since he had entered the room. "I owe you an apology. My need for justice put you in danger, and you suffered for showing me kindness when no one else would." "You don't owe me anything," Jess said, finding her voice at last. "You were trying to protect me. You warned me about her." "I tried to warn you," Bill corrected, "but I couldn't speak until today. The doctors say it sometimes happens with stroke patients. Speech can return suddenly, usually triggered by strong emotion or stress." Director Johnson cleared his throat. "Ms. Parker, in light of these revelations, your suspension is immediately lifted. The hospital will be conducting a full review of all disciplinary actions taken under Ms. Sterling's recommendations. We'll also be discussing significant compensation for the ordeal you've endured." But Bill wasn't finished. "Director Johnson, I'd like to make a proposal. Ms. Parker's compassionate care during my recovery was extraordinary. She saw a patient who needed help and provided it at personal cost to herself. That's exactly the kind of nursing this hospital should be supporting, not punishing." "What are you suggesting?" Director Johnson asked. "I'm suggesting that Jessica Parker be promoted to head of patient advocacy, with a salary commensurate with her dedication and a budget to ensure that no patient ever feels abandoned the way I did before she found me." The offer hung in the air like a gift too good to be real. Jess looked at Bill with tears in her eyes, understanding for the first time that his fight for justice had somehow become her salvation. "But more importantly," Bill continued, his voice soft with emotion he had held back for decades, "I want her to know that her kindness didn't just help me recover my voice. It helped me remember what it means to trust in human goodness again." As the meeting ended and the officials filed out to begin damage control, Jess found herself alone with Bill in the conference room where her life had just been transformed. "How did you know?" she asked. "How did you know that being kind to you would lead to all this?" Bill's smile was peaceful in a way she had never seen before. "I didn't know. I just knew that after 20 years of darkness, you were the first person to see me as worth saving. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything." Outside the conference room windows, the city stretched out below them, full of people who had no idea that justice had just been served in a small room on the 3rd floor of City General Hospital. Victoria Sterling would face federal charges that would put her away for decades. The nurses whose careers she had destroyed would find vindication and restoration. And Jessica Parker would never again have to choose between kindness and survival. But the most important transformation had happened in the heart of a man who had finally found his voice after 20 years of silence, and used it not just for revenge, but for redemption. The truth had set them all free, and sometimes that's the most shocking revelation of all.